Canada's energy sector continues to supply petrochemicals both here at home and around the world. In fact, there's nothing a consumer in this world purchases that is not thanks to oil and natural gas. As conversations of climate health and divesting of Canadian oil and gas holdings pop up, where are Canada's oil and gas resources and industries headed? Well, joining me from Calgary is Cody Battershill, founder of Canada Action. It's a volunteer-led, actually, grassroots movement encouraging Canadians to take action in support of the natural resources sectors of our nation. Cody, welcome to Bridge City News. Great to have you on today.
Hey, thanks for having me back. It's always great to be here.
Oh, well, appreciate that for sure. Well, this is such a big topic of conversation. And of course, I have to ask, how important is Canadian oil and gas on a world stage, Cody?
I mean, first and foremost, we all use oil and gas every day to stay alive, not just in transportation and heating, but also in fertilizer, also in all of the products that we use every day in our daily modern lives. So that at a fundamental level, it's all of our basic needs are assisted or facilitated through products and energy that's derived from oil and natural gas. On a global stage, we know that global oil and gas demand continues to grow. We know that Canada is a leader in reducing emissions, working with Indigenous communities, supporting human rights, and we need to be a part of the energy security calculation for our allies and trading partners globally so they can buy from Canada instead of buying from countries that aren't always reliable, don't always share our values, maybe not, they may not be democracies. There's a whole host of other reasons, and it really just solidifies the importance, the significance. And as long as the world is using oil and natural gas, it should absolutely positively be coming from Canada.
Okay, and obviously we hear a lot of negatives, a lot about those negatives of Canada's oil and gas, but you've painted kind of a picture there of why you think the oil and gas industry deserves to be placed in a more positive light.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of negatives that are not the whole story. There's a lot of people that might be protesting. They might not have all the facts. Maybe they were misled by a group that's trying to shut down Canadian energy production. But those groups aren't talking about oil imports to Canada from countries like Saudi Arabia or Russia in the past decade or decades. They're not talking about oil tankers on the West Coast from Alaska. They're not talking about what would happen if we shut down Canadian oil and gas. And what would happen is a dramatic contraction in our economy, hundreds of thousands of families, millions of Canadians without employment, without livelihoods. And we would be immediately trying to build import facilities to replace locally produced oil and gas so that we did not all descend into chaos and anarchy as a society with no power, with no heat, with no food, with no plastics to keep our hospitals running. And there's so many more layers that we could peel back on the repercussions of that.
Yeah, absolutely, Cody. Now, one of the things that many people do appreciate about Canada Action, your organization, are your infographics. So one thing that caught our eye was about electric cars. So it says that if all the cars were electric by 2040, the world would demand for oil and gas. The world demand for oil and gas would actually be at 2013 levels. So maybe can you give a few more details about the worldwide demand for oil and natural gas?
Yeah, so when we talk about electric cars, it's important to think about how those cars are made. They're made from a lot of mining, they're made from a lot of advanced plastics and composites. The batteries are quite heavy, so the cars have to be as light as possible in every other part of their production, and that's oil and natural gas derived petrochemicals. And so, even if the trajectory of electric vehicle growth continues as it's trending, we're still going to see robust oil demand. One study had said that oil demand would be around 90 million barrels a day. Another recent projection from the U.S. Energy and Information Administration said that in 2040, 2050, oil demand will still be about the level it is today. So even if it's not growing, that's still an Olympic-sized swimming pool of oil every 5-10 seconds that the globe is consuming. And yeah, let's support all energy sources and electric vehicles, but let's continue to support Canada's natural economic strengths. And a key part of that is oil and natural gas production that we do responsibly, and I would argue better than almost anywhere else in the world.
Okay. Now, you were recently in a debate involving the BC Teachers Union. So, if unions did begin to drop Canadian oil and gas companies from their pension plans, what impact would that have for Canadian companies? Or would the returns for the pension be the victim?
Well, there's a lot of, so over the last many years now, it's been shown through various studies that the returns for those pensioners has actually been reduced at times. So that's a big implication. The other implication is the symbolic action of selling some stock in publicly traded companies that have the highest standards of environment, social, and governance protections. The symbolism does nothing to reduce demand. It does nothing to help the environment. It does nothing to reduce emissions. It's just a symbolic way to take a stand, but that stand is not informed. That stand is actually contradictory to those stated goals of climate action and social progress and supporting equality and environmental protection globally. So those actions hurt Canadians, it hurts pensioners, can reduce the investment returns, and it does nothing for the environment. All it actually does is help oil and natural gas producers. And again, as I mentioned, it does not reduce demand. It's a symbolic, empty gesture that is actually a negative.
Wow. Okay, so that's just one pension plan. But if you think bigger, how can economies like those of Canada's provinces replace the economic benefits of our oil and gas industry?
Oil and natural gas is our number one export as a country. And when you look at Canada's exports, the vast majority of our top exports are natural resources. Thank a farmer, thank a forestry worker, thank a miner, thank an oil and gas worker, thank everyone who works in our grocery stores and our truck drivers, because all of these people work together to keep us living in our modern world the way that we are accustomed to. Very comfortable. Everything's at your fingertips, everything's easy. And it wasn't always like that if we look back at history. And so we absolutely have to think about the massive economic benefits. One quick stat from 2000 till 2032, there was a study that said the oil and natural gas industry would generate $1.1 trillion for our Canadian governments. And that's more than real estate and construction combined. And what does that government revenue pay for? Roads, schools, transit, clean technology initiatives, teachers, police officers, emergency responders. The basic fundamental foundation of our society as Canadians is what those government revenues fund. And so we have to be balanced. And I think as Canadians, all work together to support all Canadian energy equally.
Okay, well, Cody, this list might be too long, but what products are made from petrochemicals? Can you maybe describe what our world would look like without oil and gas?
Well, I mean, Vaclav Smil is a great author, Bill Gates' favorite author, and he's a professor in Winnipeg at the university. And he says that the modern world is built on four fundamental materials, and that's cement, steel, ammonia, and plastic. And all of those require fossil fuels. And there's no immediate way today to switch out the fossil fuel components. Let's talk about ammonia and natural gas based fertilizers. Currently, those fertilizers are feeding about half the world. We don't always think about how that fertilizer is made, but natural gas is a tremendous part of that. In Canada, in Alberta, when it's minus 40, what are we going to do for heat? What are we going to do for the plastics in hospitals? We start life in a hospital, and unfortunately, we often will end our lives in a hospital. Those plastics, those advanced materials are a fundamental part of modern medicine and our expanded lifetimes, life expectancies as humans in Canada and humans around the world. So, you know, when you look around your house, every single thing, everything you eat, everything you do, everything you own, everything you've ever done is made possible by natural resources. It's not always obvious, but oil and natural gas is a core component of everything we have, everything we do. Not just gasoline, not just plastics for the electric vehicle, but everything else I've detailed. It's incredibly important we have these more balanced conversations about this topic.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so when we think about all the modern gadgets that we have and even our utilities, What could possibly replace Canadian petrochemicals in our modern needs?
It would honestly be oil and gas imported from other countries. There's currently no substitute. So yeah, let's build wind and solar. Let's also maybe look at hydro and nuclear power. But we also are going to need oil and natural gas for a long time. There's no technology today to replace oil and natural gas in the world. And fossil fuels today are about 80% of global energy. It was about 85% 20 years ago. And it was about 90% 20 years before that. It goes to show you how long these things take. And in 20 years from now, it'll be maybe 75%. 75% of global energy with a growing global population. There's still about 3 billion people today that don't have either reliable electricity or any electricity at all, or clean cooking fuels. That's 3 billion people that would love to live like we live today
Hmm.
here. So we got to have that global perspective, do all of the above. But oil and natural gas is going nowhere anytime soon. And anyone who tells you that is ignoring the reality, the physics, the science, and honestly, the positivity and the facts about Canadian oil and natural gas.
Interesting. And of course, there's all that talk of green barrels of energy. And maybe can you compare the difference between oil and gas extraction here in Canada versus other parts of the world?
Well, a big stat that we should all be celebrating is that emissions from Canadian oil and gas production actually peaked about 8 years ago. And since then, production is up 16%, but emissions are down 7%. Now, we are a global leader in monitoring our emissions, in working on land reclamation, in reducing water consumption, in collaborating as an industry to reduce all of those environmental impacts. Now, when you look at the world's top 10 oil exporters, we're talking about Saudi Arabia, Russia, uh, the United States, Canada, Iraq, Iran, Nigeria, the UAE, Venezuela at one point, Mexico. There's all these other countries that are also we're competing with. When you look at all those countries, the top exporters, Canada is the number one ranked country for different global indices like environmental sustainability from Yale and like the Women, Peace, and Security Index and the Transparency Index through the Corruption Perception Index, which ranks transparency. We're number one of those countries. You talk about social progress, you talk about human rights, you talk about democracy, you talk about all of these important values. The environment, yes, and emissions, yes, but also how do we treat people? How do we treat all people in our society? And that's also really important. Look at what's happening in Ukraine right now. Should we be buying from countries like that are invading countries, other countries, or should we be buying friend shoring? And that's what we've been hearing more and more about. So it is incredibly important that the world gain access to increased supply of Canadian oil and natural gas. We should make all other countries compete with us. Just like we want Team Canada to win the gold in hockey, Team Canadian Resources should be winning the gold in the competition globally to supply the growing global population and growing demand for natural resources.
We only have a couple minutes left here, but when we hear about pollution across the world, can you help put Canada's pollution output into perspective when compared to other nations or regions?
Yeah, and we got to talk. So we can talk about emissions, we can talk about land, we can talk about water. I think when we talk about one quick stat regarding emissions would be that we are actually a global leader in reducing methane and flaring from our oil and gas industry. So there's a study done by the UFC that said if the rest of the world copied our standards, the average emissions from barrel of oil would reduce by 23% oil production, the upstream production emissions. That's about taking 100 million cars off the road. And if we want to talk right now about reducing global impacts, getting as much Canadian liquefied natural gas to Asia and the world will absolutely have the largest immediate impact on reducing global emissions. That's climate action today. Canadian natural gas, more Canadian oil. We rank incredibly well. I mean, Calgary, Toronto, and Vancouver over the last many years have been three of the world's top most livable places to live, some of the world's cleanest cities. We know that we have an incredibly strong consensus at a national level that we care about the environment. We also care about supporting our families, and we need to care more about having the maximum positive impact on the global trade, global security, and that's Canadian oil and natural gas, and wind and solar, and. It's all of the above. And people that are saying shut it down are ignoring the reality of how they live, how we live, the impacts, and the massive global positives that Canadian oil and natural gas brings.
All right, Cody, it looks like we are out of time, but thanks so much for joining us today and for sharing your perspective.
It's such a pleasure to be here today. Thank you so much for having me.
Awesome. My pleasure. Thank you. Cody Battershill is the founder of Canada Action, a volunteer led movement encouraging Canadians to take action in support of the natural resources sector of our nation.